Granddad was a chief in the Navy, Dad is a merchant marine, I'm a sailor right after my first tour. Me and Granddad are both medical, so we have some ghost stories. One of his stories was a case of mass somnambulism, sleepwalking, on the USS Roosevelt that he documented but was never publicly addressed or explained back in the 60s. Sleepwalking is dangerous not only because of the risks of injury, but because of the implications of underlying issues like night seizures or sleep apnea. A few dozen people sleepwalking a month is not unheard of on a carrier, but apparently in a 3-month period there was over 400+ individual cases from over 100 sailors, from lower enlisted to senior officers, that were reported independently. These people came from all over the carrier, and he said he couldn't find any link to them. He was tasked with recording, but was never briefed on why it was happening, what caused it, or why it stopped. It was just dropped. Our speculation is drugs or government testing, but we'll never know for sure. That's one of my granddad's stories. One of mine was on a smaller ship, that was getting rough turbulence while underway in the Pacific. I swear we went into some kinda Bermuda Triangle shit because we got into this super calm part. I'm assuming the eye of or some shit, I'm not a meteorologist, and it felt like an out-of-body experience. Like the world paused and everything kinda became quiet and ringing like tinnitus for what felt like at least half an hour. And then suddenly it all came flooding back, like being forced back into my body and being aware. It was still calm at that point, and we'd only felt the calm for maybe a few minutes. But I talked to some of my guys afterwards and they felt something similar. At the calm point, some said they felt high, I wouldn't know about it. One of our lieutenants said he felt like he passed out and woke up like sleepwalking. It was a surreal shared experience. Doc on the ship, our corpsman chief, said it was probably some pressure drop that made us feel disoriented though, but we still joke we all got abducted for a minute and returned. Edit, oh, and my dad said he and his shipmates saw dancing women on top of the waves all the time.
Flew helicopters in the Navy for a few years. On my first deployment to Southeast Asia, I was flying over the Sea of Japan and saw a large pulsing aura of red light far enough below the surface I could not make out a source. We were 30-ish miles from shore and had not been briefed on any assets in the area that might make something like that make sense. No erroneous indications on instruments or radio chatter. Just slow, steady pulsing red light. We saw it, circled it a few times, made a note of the time and location we encountered it, and my crew chief asked if I wouldn't mind getting the hell out of there. So we finished our transit and I made a note of everything in my debrief. I passed it up the chain of command, but they basically wrote it off as some sort of visual phenomenon we had from a long day of flying in dry suits. It's always been hard to imagine our entire crew hallucinating the same thing. Edit, I didn't think this would blow up, but I appreciate all the input. As some of you have suggested possible submerged man-made objects like buoys, I would say this is unlikely due to the sheer size of what we saw. Underwater volcanic activity, as some of you suggest, actually makes a lot of sense. The light was probably 50 meters across and very bright. Those of you that suggested volcanic activity, I would like to ask if it would have something like a rhythm to it. The light would slowly brighten for about 3 seconds, dim for the same amount of time, then remain completely off for the same amount of time. If anyone knows, I'd appreciate it, and I could pass it to some of the guys that were on that crew and maybe put some dudes at ease.
I was on navigation watch with the second mate one night off the Philippines. The ship was on autopilot making for Manila. It was a clear, still, dark night. Through the binoculars I picked up navigation lights of another ship about 5 degrees off the port bow. It was well off, but I noted the bearing and checked the radar. Nothing. This was not unusual. If it was one of the small local fishing vessels, they can be hard to pick up. On the other hand, they usually don't bother with navigation lights either. Quickish technical detail. Skip if familiar with the purpose and function of NAV lights. navigation lights on a vessel are baffled so they can only be seen from a certain direction. Looking at a boat dead ahead, coming toward you, you will see a red light to the right of a green light. This is what I could see. If the boat turns to their right or starboard, the two lights will begin to move together, and the green light will fade from view because of the baffles that are around it. As the turn continues, you will be able to see the red port, their left side, light only, and a bit later the white stern light will appear as the red fades behind its baffles. This way you can tell in an instant the orientation of another vessel in the dark. 10 minutes passed, and I checked the bearing again. Still 5 degrees off the port bow, red and green visible. I checked the radar again. Still nothing. I alerted the second mate. 5 minutes later, nothing changed, nothing on radar. We were on a collision bearing with an invisible vessel that was steadily getting closer. As a precaution, we switched back to manual steering, and I took the helm. By now, I could make out the lights without the binoculars, still coming directly at us. We were on the point of taking evasive measures when suddenly the lights started moving together. We assumed that the other vessel had finally spotted us and was turning away to their right. I was expecting the red light to fade from view, except it didn't. The two lights simply swapped position. The red went to the left and the green went to the right. They remained 5 degrees off the port bow, and then they moved back again. Still, nothing on radar, nothing through the binoculars. We eventually passed the lights within 20 meters. From the wing of the bridge, I could see with perfect clarity straight down at it, whatever it was. There was nothing to see except the two lights, one red and one green, floating freely in air about 10 feet above the ocean, reflecting back off the waves, gently and occasionally swapping positions in the night. Edit. This happened about 40 years ago. Totally forgot I was so old, lol. So, no, not drones. I did think maybe buoys at the time, but the lights weren't bobbing around with the waves as they would if they were supported on rods, which were also not visible.
I only worked as a walk-on, walk-off cabin attendant, but the old sea dogs always had far-fetched stories to tell. The engineer teaching us about watertight doors told us a story that happened to him on another ship that the same company used to own but was decommissioned and scraped in 2011. These watertight doors separate the different bulkheads, underwater compartments that stop the whole ship from sinking if there is a hole in the hull. Think about the metal doors that slid down in the engine room of the Titanic. These doors are always closed. To get from compartment to compartment, there was a lever that you pulled and the door opened. You stepped through, then as soon as you let go of the lever, the door would close. For the safety of the ship, it would close tight shut, even if there was a person blocking it. On this older ship, there was an engineer who tripped and was crushed to death in one of these doors. Years later, this engineer who told me the story tripped and fell on that same door and was about to be crushed to death in the same way, but just before killing him, it stopped and opened again, despite no one being around and nothing touching the lever. And before anyone says that there must have been some safety thing installed. And oh, as I said before, the one job of these doors is to close no matter what or who is in the way.
I work security on different ships. One time during night shift on a cruise ship, my colleague and I were in the security office watching the CCTV cameras and just talking shit to pass the time. At the exact same time, we both saw a black figure/shadow pass in front of the camera in the children's play area. We both got super freaked out but kept watching the other cameras in the vicinity to see if whatever it was passed by those, as it was the only way it could go from where we saw it and there was no way it could leave the area without passing by in front of one of the cameras. It never did, so we went to the area to check it out but obviously found nothing. Afterwards we went back to review the footage and didn't see any shadow moving in that camera again. Even though we both saw it the first time in the live feed. Needless to say, we kinda started avoiding the kids area at night after that. A lot of death happens out at sea.
I got one for you. I was in the USN 2010 to 2014 and deployed twice on 2 different ships. The first ship I was on the USS Pearl Harbor LSD-52. We were deployed doing a Westpac. There was a span of time where we were just sailing around in open waters, not near any land whatsoever. I was one of the topside watchstanders, meaning that I was responsible for reporting any other sea or air activity, i.e. other boats or airplanes. The area we were in was so incredibly remote that there was almost no activity anywhere. Didn't see a single boat or plane for days. One night I was standing the midnight to 4 a.m. watch and had just switched to the forward lookout. So I'm standing at the bridge of the ship on the outer deck looking forward. It must have been about 3:45 a.m. because my relief just came up to let me know he would take over from here. We talked for a few minutes when all of a sudden I got a call from the bridge. The officer on duty was asking me what that was. Me and my watch relief look forward and there is this giant light coming out of the ocean. This thing was huge, probably the size of 2 mobile homes put side by side. It comes up from the ocean and then passes overhead maybe 70 feet from the top of the ship, and there was absolutely no sound. Everyone started freaking out. And the craziest thing is that none of our radars picked up any activity whatsoever. We all were just in awe, and no one had any explanation, but we all agreed that we witnessed a UFO.
I was in the U.S. Navy and worked in communications. I was a supervisor on my watch and enjoyed working the night tours while on deployment. We stood 12-hour watches from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Around 2 a.m. I hear some chatter over the 3MC, which is like our internal speaker system used between a few different stations on the ship. It's the bridge asking combat if they see anything on surface or air radar, maybe 10 miles out to our west. Combat returns with a negative and I don't think anything of it. About 15 minutes goes by and the bridge asks again, and asks are they sure there's nothing there. Then they ask us if we have any message traffic about any ships in the area, aircraft or anomalous weather patterns. I ask one of the guys on watch to perform the request and now my interest is piqued. I walk out of the comm center and head up to the bridge. I was on a frigate so the walk was quick, and I get up there and ask what's going on. One of my buddies points me over to the port side and we walk over. There's about 5 or 6 circular-shaped lights about 10 to 15 miles out in the clouds, pretty large. They aren't moving or flying around, but just looking stable. These lights are also casting lights downward on the ocean, and you can see the light refracting back at the water, almost as if it were a spotlight or a beam. From what we could see, it didn't appear to be lights shining up from the water because they wouldn't pass through the clouds. The clouds also weren't super thick, it was lightly overcast, and it was the middle of the night with no other light pollution on the water. There was nothing in message traffic about any ships, subs, or aircraft in the area. We were hundreds of miles from land and the last report of any unusual weather patterns was a water spout a few hundred miles away. We tried to take pictures with our onboard digital camera, using a long exposure, but we couldn't capture the phenomenon. After about 90 minutes the lights slowly faded, one by one, and within 15 minutes they had completely disappeared. I'm sure there's some sort of weather or atmospheric condition for what we saw, but for all intents and purposes, it fit the description of a UFO. Unidentified flying object.
Was an AUV pilot on a ship mapping the Titanic debris field for the Titanic's 100-year anniversary episode on the History Channel. It was a 3 by 5 mile survey, so a lot of area that hadn't been mapped before. The ROV on board was taking video footage of the larger hull section, and would bump into the Titanic when they got too close, and parts of the hull would get stuck to the ROV we called rustic-less. I was 22 at the time, and thought, cool, part of the Titanic hull, and took a big chunk of iron hull. Wrote to my dad about it, very excited about my new artifact. He has been an ocean explorer for my whole life, and is very easygoing pretty much all the time, but he became extremely serious after I told him. He said, let's not tempt fate here. Don't ever take anything from a grave site. Ever. Throw it back in the ocean. Please. I guess he has friends that swore they had become cursed after taking artifacts from grave sites, like the strange curses of the archaeologists who opened some of the pyramids of Egypt. So as any 22 years old would do, I kept it in my bunk room. Sure enough, the next day I got this awful fever and felt terribly ill. Very off, and was bedridden on a work trip. No one else on the ship was sick, and of course naturally thought, I'm cursed. I got the plague, so threw it back when we were back over the wreck site and sure enough got better that day. I mentioned it to some of our more senior team and they all had stories of people getting cursed after taking and keeping things from a grave site. And that things would mystery get better if they returned what they had taken. Weird juju there. Respect the dead.
One of my dad's best friends in high school was a yacht guy and did the thing where he sailed around the world years and years ago. He went with his wife, my dad, my uncle, and a few others of their good friends. They always talked it up and never really shut up about it. When I was a cringy preteen, pretending and failing to be edgy, I asked what the worst part was. Dad, yacht guy, his wife, and my uncle all got really quiet and uncomfortable. It took a little bit of prodding, but then they told us about the vest. On the final leg across the Atlantic, they were all tired and looking forward to only having about 2.5 weeks left on the ocean. Yacht guy and his wife were below deck with my dad and uncle when they heard one of the other crew shout, "There is someone in the water." They got up on deck and started to immediately hear what sounded like a small child crying for help. My uncle, who's not really a talker, interjected that it wasn't an ambiguous or misunderstood scream, it was a clear and definite, "Help." They all start looking around trying to see any sign of the child. They said the ocean wasn't exactly calm, rolling waves around them, so no clear line of sight. Yacht wife said she saw what looked like a small bright bobbing child off the port stern. She says she yelled to my uncle, who was in the wheel, and they turned hard right trying to get to the girl. After another minute of cries for help, there was suddenly a piercing scream, and then silence. They all immediately jumped and turned behind them, each person thinking the scream had literally been behind their backs. At this point they were all really freaked until they looked back to the stern and saw an old yellow faded and frayed life jacket, not 2 yards off the bow. Yacht guy described it as an old life jacket, something from the 60s or maybe the 50s, but even old by the time they went on their trip. My dad grabbed a hook and tried to pull it in, but missed and the jacket quickly drifted out of reach. They said they all started watching it drift away. Right as it crested a wave and fell out sight, all of them swore they saw a small child in the vest. Then it dropped onto the other side of the wave and they didn't see it again. This gave me the heebie-jeebies when I heard this story. They might have been screwing with me, but my uncle got very disconcerting when telling the story with Dad and Yacht guy, which is concerning cause he's usually a calm and level-headed guy.
One night, very late, 3 to 3:30 a.m. or so, near the end of my bridge watch shift in the middle of the Indian Ocean while serving on a Navy destroyer, I witnessed an absolutely surreal, mesmerizing, and powerfully moving bioluminescence display and its behavior and interaction in a wild electrical storm. I was already familiar with bioluminescence a bit prior to this, having been stationed in San Diego before this deployment and seeing a few small but still incredibly cool instances of it right near the beaches in my neighborhood there. But this particular occasion on this deployment was something I had never imagined was possible. It was a blazing hot, muggy night out there and pitch black. The air was so thick with humidity that no starlight or moonlight came through it, and we were at least 1,000 miles off any coastline. The only light that punctured that sometimes disorienting, endless dark horizon was occasional flashes of lightning way off in the distance from some growing thunderstorms. Nothing unusual yet, pretty standard night watch for that remote part of the world. Over the course of about 20 to 30 minutes, we had moved much closer to the cluster of storms, and the lightning was getting much more intense and vivid. I went out on the bridge wing with a couple of the other sailors on the bridge team to watch what was now pretty quickly becoming a highly unusual frequency of lightning and deep, heavy crashing of thunder. And that's when we started noticing what was happening on the surface of the water. While still a considerable ways off out in front of us, general direction of the ship's heading, we saw bolt after bolt after bolt of lightning, at various distances but mostly within seconds of each other, actually striking the surface of the water and causing a whitish glow to emanate in the area where it made contact. I've seen quite a few heavy storms way out in the middle of nowhere on the ocean, but can't recall ever seeing the lightning actually making contact with the water like that. That alone was breathtaking and bizarre to witness. A few minutes of this went by, and then the real show began. The lightning became slightly less frequent, but the individual bolts seemed to be more powerful. And from the area on the surface of the water they made contact, we began seeing these pulsating, rhythmic, dazzling areas of neon bluish and green bioluminescence rapidly radiating out in circular patterns and continuing out over great distances. Like a ripple effect when you throw a rock into a calm lake, or a chain reaction in combustion. All of us on the bridge were just spellbound. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing, except that there were half a dozen other witnesses up there with me seeing and confirming the same thing. It felt cosmic. It's like everything was completely electrified. The air, the ocean, in between the chest-rattling booms of thunder, you could almost even hear a buzzing or crackling all around like you hear sometimes around down power wires or something. We were radioing down to various other watches inside the ship trying to get them to rotate up here when they could to come see too, because honestly no description could have really done it justice. This only lasted a few more minutes though, before the lightning stopped striking the ocean surface and went back to only bouncing and forking up in the clouds again, with the pulses of bioluminescence fading with it. That happened almost 10 years ago now, but I can still see and hear those incredible minutes very clearly when I think about it again. What an experience.
My father was a young teen during WW2. He lived in northern Norway and my grandfather had a fishing vessel. Fishing under German occupation was very strict and they often had to work with no additional lights because of fear of being caught. But once they got far enough out into the ocean, the stars and moon would be more than enough to work by. My father was a very scientific and non-religious man to the very day he died. He saw loads of cool stuff but was very careful to explain to us about how the water tricks your eyes. Like how sometimes you could be tricked into seeing mermaids or that the whale was much, much bigger than it really was, hence the stories of giant creatures, etc. But he saw some shit that he couldn't explain, like the hovering lights that would silently appear, hover in the sky, sometimes fly around the ship. Like how a drone would nowadays, but from many meters away. Always silent. And he said a few times when the moon was big enough, the thing looked flat and round. No way was this a contemporary aircraft at the time. And it wasn't until he moved to the US many decades later that he saw the typical UFO/flying saucer thing and said that was exactly what he saw. Many occurrences of seeing people work on the ship that weren't really there. He would see someone working in the corner of his eye, turn to get a better look at them, think it's one of the other sailors, continue working some more, and next time he looks up, they are gone, and none of the others had been in that area of the ship. Once there was a really bad storm and they had all tied themselves to the masts of the ship. He could feel the rope loosening around his waist and there was more room between him and the mast. He tried to retighten it, but there was so much cold water bombarding him that his hands didn't work fast enough. He said he remembered thinking, I am going to die now, but then someone appeared in front of him, a tall man, wide-shouldered, but my dad couldn't see his face. The man retied my father to the mast. The man had no rope attached to him. The knot was tightened just before a huge wave came and took the man away. My father thought one of his colleagues had been thrown overboard and started shouting, but they couldn't hear each other because of how loud the waves were. When the storm started to die down, he just kept shouting, "Man overboard." They all started doing a body count and everyone was accounted for. He talked to my grandfather about it in private afterwards, and my grandfather replied that sometimes the spirit of a dead sailor/fisherman shows up to help out, sometimes it's to recoil the rope, sometimes it's to save their lives. And then he proceeded to tell my father a few of his own stories. My dad never forgot this incident because everything else could be explained by him being overworked, seeing things, mind playing tricks on you, etc., but there was no doubt that someone or something had tightened him to the mast during that storm. Ropes just don't retighten themselves.
This happened to a friend of mine, let's call him Dave, who worked on an offshore rig. He wasn't much of a believer in supernatural stuff and spirits. Mostly cause he had never experienced anything and thought that most stories were just exaggerated. In the past, that rig faced a tragedy where it was set ablaze and many people lost their lives. The captain at the time was the type of person who would help people first and then look after himself. He ran into a flaming room to help a few people who were stuck inside, and while helping them he lost his life. As they were able to control the fire and eventually kill it, many people lost their lives and it would take days for ships to arrive to carry the deceased back to the mainland. So they stored all the corpses in one room. That room was the captain's room. Years later, after the rig was rebuilt and functional again, Dave started working on it as a fresher. Being the new guy, he was given small jobs at first so that he would familiarize himself with everything. He didn't know this when he joined, but the room that was allotted to him was the same room that they stored the bodies in, also the captain's room. Dave was supposed to have a roommate bunk with him, but the guy would join him a week later. Before his roommate joined, every other night Dave would wake up to being violently shaken in his bed while hearing someone yell, "There's a fire! There's a fire!" He would also dream of people that he never knew. He'd see their faces and the next thing would be glimpses of them burnt. This frightened the shit out of Dave. He approached his captain and spoke to him about all that happened. His captain then revealed the whole story of what happened and whose room he was occupying. The captain told Dave that if this persisted then he'd change the room. But fortunately that was the same day Dave's roommate joined and the thing stopped happening. One day while getting off a crane from the ladder, Dave missed his step and was about to fall. Although it was just a few feet above the platform, with all the equipment he had on he would have definitely fractured something and wouldn't be able to work for months. But as he was falling, someone held him from behind and pushed him back onto the ladder. He grabbed on and got down safely. As he turned to thank the person, he could find nobody there. When he went to the cafeteria, he asked his colleagues who was out there with him so that he could thank them. His colleagues revealed that he was the only one out there at that time. He found it weird but didn't say much about it. Dave approached the captain again and spoke to him about this. His captain told him that it was most likely the captain who died on the rig, saving and helping people while he still can. Now if you ask Dave about his belief in this stuff, he'll give you a really puzzled look as though he himself is still trying to make logic and reason out of what he experienced.
This is going to be intentionally vague to avoid saying anything classified. Was on a submarine. Near the end of the underway, I was in the galley helping out, because I was bored. My normal department is engineering. One of the sonar techs comes running down to the galley to show me a piece of paper. One of the sonar instruments gives a visualization of the data it collects, again, intentionally vague. It had drawn a picture of my face. I have no idea how, but it was very clearly my face. My face is distinct. I have no explanation and there were no real consequences, but to me, that makes it creepier. Just the ocean making noises that render out as my face. NBD.
This happened to me and my father, and while not exactly on open water, I think it still belongs here. In the late 80s, early 90s, my dad was living and working around the Prince William Sound in Alaska as a logger. I would often visit him during the summer and it was great fun. One year I visited in December due to plans I had coming up that summer. He lived with a few other loggers very remotely on a lake in a houseboat. I remember having to take a ferry, truck, snowmobile, then dinghy to reach the boat from Anchorage. This year being December, the lake was frozen and we just rode the snowmobiles directly across the ice. My second night there was crystal clear from the cold and all stars were out. My dad and his logging buddies were up late drinking, playing music and just relaxing. I was sitting at a window playing a Game Boy. I looked out the window and on the far side of the lake, probably a quarter mile, I saw a polar bear walking on hind legs. I was really excited as I have never seen a polar bear before. I yelled and said to my dad, "Look, a bear." My dad and his buddies all jumped out of their seats with very serious looks on their faces and grabbed pairs of binoculars and looked through them, saying there shouldn't be any polar bears in that particular area. And while my father was looking through the binoculars, he said, "Tom, it's back." Tom being one of the fellas there. As they looked at it through the binoculars, it moved slowly across the far side of the lake, up the bank and into the trees. Tom ran into the other room and came out with rifles. The attitude around the boat had completely changed. Everybody was on edge and any sense of relaxation was gone. Each of them holding a rifle. This is the first time I've ever seen fear in my dad's face. They stayed up the rest of the night. I don't believe anybody slept. My dad wouldn't speak to me about it at all, saying it was just a bear. The next morning it was as if it never happened and he never brought it up again. I had completely forgotten about this until years later it just popped into my mind. So I called my dad and asked him about it. He said he remembered it vividly. He told me throughout the winter months of that year and only while the lake was frozen they had seen what they had also thought to be a bear walking on its hind legs, which isn't uncommon for bears to do sometimes. Worried the bear was getting too close to the houseboat because of the frozen ice one night, they had fired some shots to scare it off. The shots didn't seem to faze it at all, and it continued to come back almost nightly and cross the ice. Finally they got fed up with its strange behavior and looked at it through a set of binoculars to see what was wrong with it. My dad said at this point what they saw still scared him to think about to this day. What they saw wasn't a bear at all, but instead looked like a giant floating white jellyfish that was glowing and gliding across the top of the ice. They would see it until the ice melted later that year, and each time they saw it my dad said it would make them feel anxiety and fear. Once the lake thawed they never saw it again. Within a year of this incident, he had moved back to the continental US.